Hi, everybody. Welcome to the We Have Issues podcast. Today we have Lauren Onak on our show today, and we're going to have a discussion with her, ask her about her journey and where she came from and how she got to where she is today. We'll talk about, her local and national campaign and, where she's from and how she's developing her skills in Massachusetts. And it will also pick apart her run last year for the library board. But once again, my name is Carvell.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Matt.
And this is Lauren Onak. So, Lauren, so last year you ran for the library board. I'm sure you had a lot of good competition and a lot of points that you kind of had to bring about, because I'm not sure, but I would imagine not a lot of people knew about the American Solidarity Party. Could you tell us about your journey and how that went?
Sure. Well, I'll start with coming to the ASP because I think it will make sense of a lot of the issues I ran into during the library board campaign. I was raised in a pretty moderate household. My parents became more politically active during the Bush administration and became more active in the Democratic Party as I became a teenager. I moved to New York City for college, wasn't very politically informed, was sort of nominally pro-choice at the time. And I started becoming more committed to my faith. I starting to think about what it would look like to be a committed Christian politically. I had a very specific experience of coming to the pro-life movement. I was sort of becoming increasingly dubious about my pro-choice views. And I remember very distinctly, I went to an event. It was Christmas caroling in front of one of the convents of the Sisters of Life, who are a religious order that help women who are going through crisis pregnancies. So I was caroling in front of this convent. Because, in college, you kind of say yes to going to rallies and different things, even if you don't fully agree with what you're doing. And I got there, and we were doing the caroling, and I looked through the window of the convent. Now, this was on the west side, and it was a convent where women going through crisis pregnancies would live during their pregnancy, and then when they gave birth, they'd stay there for about an additional year. There was this little girl living there at the time, a baby. She was extremely cute. She was in all of their promotional literature, and she had these dark eyes and this curly hair. And I was looking into her eyes, looking at her through the window, and I won't say God spoke to me, but I felt very convicted at that moment. If we didn't have people vocal in the pro-life square, this little girl would not be looking back at you. If someone hadn't said something, this girl would not be looking back at you. And that started a journey for me, getting to know sort of the Republican scene in New York City, becoming kind of a single issue voter on the pro-life issue. Then after college, sort of becoming disenchanted with both parties. It was as we were moving towards the Trump years, I was looking for a political home. Part of what worried me, and I think worries, this is one of the reasons you're doing this podcast, right, is the extreme polarization and the lack of communication I was seeing between people of different camps. I felt like, for me, that came to a head on January 6th, 2021. And so I thought, what can I do that's going to be useful? Because all I'm seeing is vitriol. And it just so happened that later that week, I got a Facebook invitation to a call, an ASP call. It was like a sort of how to get involved locally call. I logged on and sort of listened to, at the time was Albert Thompson speaking about how to figure out how your local town is governed and ordered. And so I logged on, and as it happened, I got a call from someone in the party the next day saying, I noticed that you live in Massachusetts. We don't have leadership there at the moment. would you be willing to take on leading Massachusetts? And I was sort of, I can see you guys nodding because this is how it works.
That's how ASP works, yes.
And I said, well, I can do my best. And so now, about 5 years later, that is where I am. So that's how I ended up joining the ASP and becoming really more involved.
What has been the struggle for you when it comes to the ASP?
So I think, and this is kind of going into the 2024 campaign, I think for any third-party candidate, the biggest point of contention, the biggest thing they have to convince voters is that their vote is not being wasted. That's kind of the refrain that you hear. So there's a lot of other obstacles, and your listeners might already know about some of this. I mean, you said you spoke to Dwayne, who's doing the gubernatorial race out in California. So when you are a third-party candidate, you are usually fundraising for ballot access, right? So the presidential campaign for third-party candidates actually starts very early. Peter and I started, he was nominated by the party June of 2023. So almost a year and a half before the national election, right? And the reason that happened so early is because each year it becomes more and more expensive to raise money for ballot access. And so we need a long lead up of time to raise that money. I can get into some of the specifics. I don't know if you want to go into it later, but things like COVID affected the price of gathering signatures. For example, when Brian, Carroll, and Amar Patel were on the ballot in Wisconsin in 2020, the cost of ballot access in Wisconsin was about $10,000. By the time Peter and I were running in 2024, it had gone up to $40,000.
And Lauren, that cost, that's paying signature collectors to get that. That's not money that the state's getting, right?
Right. That is, yeah, exactly. You're paying someone to get volunteers or get employees to gather signatures for you. So in a party the size of ours, right, we've got some members in Wisconsin, but we don't have enough to gather. I forget the exact number. Every state's a little different, maybe around 5,000 signatures to get ballot access. As I'm sure you are aware and your listeners are aware, people's interest in the presidential campaign grows a lot in the few months leading up to the campaign, but at that point, it's too late to pay for ballot access in any of these places. At that point, you've got to have your ducks in a row. So one of the big challenges, just from a logistical point of view, is the fundraising aspect. And we like to joke in the ASP that the only thing the two major parties can agree on is that they want to keep third parties off the ballot as much as possible. So states like Colorado, where it used to be very easy to get on the ballot, has made it very difficult. Arkansas is changing. So we were able to slip in under the deadline for that. These things are in flux, and you're looking at the logistics of 50 states in addition to that. So that's sort of the logistical complication, but then the ideological, or sort of, what you're trying to convince people is that they actually have a choice beyond the two major parties, that they have a choice that they can vote their conscience, and that the only way, at least this is my belief, the only way to get the attention of major parties is to take away their votes and to have them lose. So if you looked at Wisconsin in 2020, the difference between Trump and Biden was smaller than the number of people that voted for third parties that year. You better believe that both the Democratic and Republican campaigns were looking very closely at Wisconsin in 2024. It is sort of a long view, and I understand this was sort of, the most interesting things I got to do on the campaign were talk to young people. I got to do a few talks on college campuses, and they were very concerned about, rightly so, about the ramifications of their vote here and now. Part of what you're trying to explain to people is the long term, sort of the long view. taking the long view of, the United States as a whole. Okay, if we keep electing people from the left and the right with more extreme positions, are we ever going to kind of reach any common ground on issues? Can we rely on the people we're elect to work with people across the aisle? These kinds of questions of, are we just making two camps of people that are going to dislike each other more and more? So these sorts of things are what you're trying to convince people. And I would always say, because I had a lot of young people ask things about really questions that were matters of conscience. And I would always tell these people, I can't tell you who to vote for, right? I can give you the reasons why I think you should vote for Peter Sonsby. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to work that out in your own conscience. And your decision has to sit well with you, right? So I think that it's hard because people feel very judged or anxious about these decisions. And they are weighty decisions. I think a lot of the young people I met were taking it very seriously, which is a good thing. But there are many, many, many factors that go into why someone chooses a candidate. And so I could address the problems I saw, and I could address, look, if we make this compromise here, we might not get this back. I think that the big example I used on pro-life issues were the compromises the GOP made in their 2024 goals and pro-life issues. And I said, look, if we put a rubber stamp on this, if the pro-life movement accepts this, we're not getting these concessions back. This is gone. And that was, those are the arguments that we proposed to people. But then what they go and do with that decision has to sit well with them. Honestly, I love talking to the young people because they were taking it so seriously, because they really, they're not as embedded in a political identity as older people are. So that was really fun and really awesome. But those are just kind of the two big general obstacles that you face when you're running a third-party campaign.
Lauren, you just mentioned Wisconsin and how the margin of victory was greater than all the third-party candidates combined. Third parties didn't cause Biden to win in 2020. They didn't cause Trump to win in 2024, right? Because it just didn't reach that point. But for me, I think it's kind of more powerful if third parties were the reason X candidate got elected or didn't get elected, because it shows the dissatisfaction that people have towards whichever party it is, because they I feel like a lot of the Democrats and Republicans just take our votes for granted, where they don't have to earn votes, they're expected votes. And to me, that kind of is like a disdain for your constituents. Third parties, we're out here like struggling, like really working to get your vote. Like we believe the things you actually believe instead of saying the things we think you believe in, like the Democrats and Republicans do. So the only way you can get, in my opinion, my philosophy is the only way you can get what you want is by voting for what you want. Because if you vote for what you want, you might not get it. If you vote for what you don't want, you will always get it. Do you feel like during your campaign or, within the party even, that there's this kind of undercurrent of we're not all in? Like people who vote ASP are not all into the party. We're kind of like, this is the backup because I actually want to make sure that, there's a Republican in the presidency who will appoint pro-life justices, or there's a Democrat in the presidency so that my neighbors don't get deported. Do you think that we would be a much stronger political force if we were committed to American Solidarity Party first and the whole package of values we have, rather than kind of focusing on certain policies and values?
That's a really good question. So I just want to go back The point I was making about Wisconsin was that the 2020, not 2024, which you're right, the third party vote did not make a difference with the margin, but the 2020 vote, the number of third party votes actually was higher than the margin of difference. So I totally agree with you. I think that is what makes people turn their heads, right? One thing I've learned being in a third party is that we have people coming to us from different sides of the spectrum, from different paths and parties. We can't pretend that that's not going to influence their particular tastes and their particular feelings about which issues they think are the most important. What you're saying resonates with me because after the campaign was over, I had people from my community coming up to me and saying, well, at least aren't you glad it wasn't Kamala? And I'm like, I ran against both of them for 16 months of my life. Like I spent 16 months my son was 6 months old when the campaign started, right? I could have been doing a lot of other things. And I could have been doing a lot of less high profile things than putting a target on my back and saying, not literally, I mean, I was never threatened, but then this, if I wanted one of them to win, I could have gone and campaigned for one of them. But the whole point was that we were running something different. And so I do think that you are correct in that there's different levels of engagement. There are the people that are committed to a third party through and through. They've been involved for a long time. They might have their particular preferences on certain issues, but in the end of the day, they would vote for a major party candidate if they had no other options on the ballot, for example. And then there are the people that are going to sway that particular election, that particular year. So people who are registered in major party, who are registered independent, who might not be on board with everything, but they're angry enough about certain things that they're gonna go your way. It's so funny how much we are shaped by this idea that we have to choose the lesser of two evils, because you do come across so many people who, like you said, think like, oh, you must be working towards some secret preference. You must be trying to steal votes from so-and-so. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, we're representing a set of values that has some overlap with the major parties, but that has some distinctions that for us make it, at least for me personally, make it feel impossible to support one of the other candidates wholeheartedly. So this is why I'm making this decision. And for me, and I've sort of come to a place where this party best represents my political identity. And I think one of the strengths, and I will say I've learned more about politics from members of this party than anywhere else. Because we have people that left both major parties, and we have people that have seen inside of those machines. And I'm not saying everyone who works for those in those capacities is a bad person. They're good people working in the political system for sure, but they've seen what the pros and cons are of those things. They're able to bring that to where we are. I do think it becomes a level of involvement where the more you learn about these issues and the more complex you see that they are. I can give a personal example of Second Amendment. So our party didn't have anything in the platform on the Second Amendment for a long time because it was a very divisive issue among members. Peter asked them to put something because he said, hey, I'm running. There's these school shootings. There's different things going on. I have to be able to say something. And what we came to, I think, was pretty moderate in terms of the position. But I grew up in a family where guns were evil, people who owned guns were crazy, and I didn't know anybody who was a gun enthusiast, right? Years and years later, coming to the party, I'm speaking to people who are gun owners, who are hunters, who are former military, who are in law enforcement. And I'm suddenly having to reevaluate my ideas about gun control, about people who own guns. That's just one kind of big example for me that I didn't really know much about, background check systems, statistics around gun violence, right? And I wouldn't say now I'm going to go out and purchase a firearm. That's probably never going to be me. But at the same time, I'm able to like kind of have these conversations that I probably wouldn't have been able to have before coming into the party. There are these sort of issues that you kind of come in with your area of expertise. And then the great thing about being a member of the American Solidarity Party is if there is some niche issue that you don't know anything about, you will find someone who knows a lot about light pollution and they will talk to you about it. And it's actually, I found more interesting than the standard discourse going on online.
I love that that's in the platform, by the way. I honestly do. That is just one of those cute little quirky things that it's like, you don't think about it, but it's like, yeah, I kind of don't like light pollution when I think about it.
Well, and that's one of those things, Chris, that the major parties kind of sleep on those little tiny issues like that because they go for what generates the views, what's the clickbait, what gets into the news. So, obviously abortion, guns, these are big issues, but the ASP, we are in a position where we can really dig down into those little minor details. And that's, I think that's going to be helpful to bringing people into the party because most people I think people are burnt out on politics right now. I think it's becoming background noise. I mean, I'm supposed to watch this stuff so we can make this podcast and so I can know what other members of the ASP are talking about. The past month, I've been tuning out of it just because I'm over it because you can talk about it and no matter what anybody does, whatever crazy thing Trump's doing, if it does anything, it makes everything worse. So
yeah, no, there's a lot of truth to that, man. I for a while, I didn't know that there was a partial shutdown.
Yeah,
because with Iran going on and the Epstein files, and it's like, what airports are, people, what's going on? And then you find out, wait, there's a partial shutdown. I'm like, wow, if this was the only thing going on, it would be really big news, but we're all getting fatigued a little bit.
It is fatigue, and we don't see those little things like that influence our lives. Like most people, when they freak out about government shutdowns, but most people don't even realize it's happening. But like your light pollution, Chris, people see that. The data center issue that people have brought up with AI, people are feeling the effects of that. Lauren, I know one of the things that you work in is natural family planning. And I feel like, Trump has touched on IVF and procedures like that. But for the most part, I don't feel like the general population knows where to go on an issue like that. And I like that we have that in our platform. I have plenty of friends that it's at odds with, and out of respect for them, I understand, but that's one of those issues that we need a political party to stand up and say, this is what we believe and this is the reason why.
With the background in natural family planning, a lot of what that has taught me, and I think a lot of people experience this, and it's part of disillusionment with both major parties. It's it's definitely a huge current right now with healthcare reform, but people feeling, or especially women feeling, ignored by their doctors and certain symptoms that they're having or things that shouldn't still be a medical mystery, but are, or at least are treated like a medical mystery in terms of their health and their reproductive health. And so while that's less political in nature, it definitely has brought me face to face with people who are suffering from some sort of just a lack of expertise from the medical institutes in this field that should be understood more broadly because it affects half the population. And it just feels very frustrating when I have a woman on the phone saying, well, I don't want to take hormones that are going to suppress ovulation. So which doctor can I go see that's not going to just put me on the pill? And I have to say, look, in New England, you're going to have to drive from Boston, maybe to Manchester, New Hampshire. Maybe you're going to have to drive an hour and a half away and wait 6 months to see a doctor who's going to read a chart. I mean, that's ridiculous. Don't get me off on that tangent because that's my other but it hurts my heart to have to tell women that they're gonna have a hard time finding a care provider who's gonna take them seriously with some of this stuff.
And RFK got vilified so much with the Maha movement, but that was so odd to me. It's been a strange journey to me to watch how like the liberal hippie crowd has morphed into the big pharma crowd, and now you have the conservatives who are like organic farming and raising chickens in their backyard and things like that. So it is frustrating that. And that to their credit, that is something the Trump administration did try to work on, is some sort of preventative, some kind of, preemptive strike on our health.
Yeah, it's funny because I live in Massachusetts and I moved here during the pandemic, and people always talk about what a liberal state it is. But the year before I moved here, I believe it was, they couldn't pass a flu shot mandate in Massachusetts. So to your point, like some of these things we associate with a more liberal crowd, like in Massachusetts, where yes, they were like, no way, like we don't want this, mandate for a flu shot for our children. Given like kind of the dialogue going on now, you'd think that sort of thing would pass here, right? But it's like, it's very interesting because I think, I have a lot of opinions about that, which are less related to ASP platform stuff, right. But I do worry about, and definitely see in a lot of the circles I'm in right now, a huge erosion of trust in these kinds of institutions. And I can't necessarily blame them entirely for that erosion of trust, because I've experienced, difficulties with doctors myself, but it's definitely it's a hot topic right now, obviously with Maha and everything going on.
I just think people just look at what color the font is for the directive they're getting, to decide whether it's good or bad.
Lauren, you brought up a lot of things that women dealt with. And so I'm more curious about your position, especially with running as a woman, because we've seen, especially in the general elections, how women have not been as successful. We don't know. I mean, we can speculate why, but, we have Sarah Palin, Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, all that have been unsuccessful. What was, as a woman running, what was your viewpoint, and how did you feel your constituents and people viewed you and took you, considering you're a woman?
I think what Peter and the party wanted to do with the ticket was to have some balance, not only gender-wise, but also generationally. Peter had, he's a grandfather. He's kind of got that grandfatherly wisdom, and he's been an elected official in his town for a long time. I think he's finally moving, but at the time he was. And so they wanted a millennial, someone who was a little bit younger, but also just balancing someone who had a long and respected career in journalism like Peter did. I was and am at the time of running a stay-at-home mom. And so just having that balance. What I will say about running as a woman is that and I'm sure your wives and friends would have gone through this too, have sort of experienced the ways in which the abortion industry has hurt women, the ways in which hyper focus on capitalism, sort of the evils of capitalism, have hurt women. Lack of comprehensive maternity leave, lack of nursing facilities in places of employment, all of these different pieces which fall on different sides of the aisle technically, right? Different sides advocating for different things, but how the lack of compromise on some very basic common sense things have ultimately deterred women who want to have more children. We have this data, right? That the average American woman would like to have one more child than she has. That's a huge decision that these women are saying are driven by some of these social factors. Now, can we know that for sure? Exactly? No. But this is what the data is telling us, right? That the birth rate is dropping and that women would like to be having more children than they're having. There was this really brilliant article in the Washington Post a few months before the last presidential election that had a list of like 25 different bipartisan supported measures that would help parents that could pass, right? They'd either been passed at the state level in various states. It sort of felt like, why are we just sitting on this? Why aren't you getting to work and actually doing these things that are going to help families have it easier? And in a sense, there's a lot of different parts of our platform that touch on the experiences of women and what they go through. But part of the reason I said yes when Peter asked me to be his running mate was I've seen the damage done to my generation of women. I've seen how overworked, undercared for they are. And that's not to, I think what some pro-women advocates do is sort of pit women against men. And I'm also seeing a huge increase in this adversity between men and women online, in the way
1,000% true.
Yeah, and the way women talk about men, it's almost like this idea that you can't trust anyone. And this is a larger cultural problem. I mean, this goes into you can't trust your neighbor anymore. You can't trust, and then all these social community supports kind of break down as a result. I don't think necessarily on the campaign I was hyper focused on any aspect of femininity, but it was just that I could say that we can do better for women. We can do better for women, not only in the pro-life arena, but in all these different issues, because ultimately what the party wants is for families to be able to flourish. And so that's going to affect both men and women. It was definitely a privilege to be a part of it, because I did meet there are a lot of really wonderful women that I've met in the party, and then just like on the road on campaign stops, there were a lot of really great people. So that was definitely a huge privilege.
Since we're talking about the presidential campaign and you running as the vice president, going into that convention, did you have any sort of inkling that you were going to be tapped to be the VP at that time? Or how did that kind of come to be?
So the way it worked was actually there was a short list of people. So Peter had asked me in advance of that convention if I would accept nomination at the convention, and I had said yes. But before that, it was sort of, will you put your name into a pool of candidates? And that was sort of the discernment process. So praying and talking to my husband and sort of saying, is this the right, I mean, we had just had our son. It was sort of like our third kid. Was sort of like, is this the right time for this? And oddly, because my kids are so young, they're not as enmeshed in like sports and activities yet and stuff like that. And I thought, well, in 4 years or 8 years, I'm not going to have as much time for this, oddly. Even though my kids are younger, it would seem counterintuitive. But I thought this might be the best chance I have for this until many, many years from now. And Peter asked me, and it was funny because, you were talking about before about, whether people are wholeheartedly behind the party. Peter asked me, do you think your liberal friends are going to give you a hard time about this, given some of the party stances? And I said, well, to be honest, if the people that are liberal who are my close friends, they already know where I stand on a lot of this stuff. I'm a little more worried about Trump supporters in my community when they find out. And that was really funny because the majority of criticism we got was from Trump supporters. So I think the biggest thing with discerning it was kind of keep my kids off the internet, in terms of like their photos and things like that, which that ended up being relatively simple to do. And, am I going to be comfortable with having my name associated with this? Because now whenever I apply for a job, or as we can talk about with the library campaign, you can Google me now.
I did.
There's no, I can't lie about, not that I want to lie about my positions, but, we can talk about the library campaign when I was running for a local office that had nothing to do with most of the party platform, right? People found the ASP campaign, and that was used against me in that in that circumstance. So it's very interesting. Now I kind of have no anonymity, and it's very funny because like nobody knows who you are really for third party stuff. There's just a very specific like section of people who've heard of you, right? But when I run into someone and they say, you look familiar, I don't want, I'm always wondering, was it from that? Like, what was I familiar?
Oh, you should play that up so bad.
Yeah. You don't want to lead with, I ran for vice president of the United States. So for some people that will come off as crazy. It's funny because I do think about it now. My youngest is starting preschool next year, so I've been applying for some jobs. And I'm thinking, are they going to look it up? You know what I mean? So it was a big decision. Ultimately, I wouldn't have done it otherwise. I think it was the right decision, but it does have some lasting impact that I don't know if I thought through everything about it before, but.
To be fair, Lauren, I mean, there was a guy who ran that wore a boot on his head and promised a pony to everybody. So the third party craziness, yeah, I could see where that would affect you.
But we weren't the craziest.
No, not by a long shot. So tell us about that. Expand on the library board. I've heard whispers of this in group chats and stuff among party members. So I want to know what went on with that. The library boards are brutal. Like those races, like they get into the library.
Yeah, so if you noticed, Amar Patel and then a bunch of Illinois members ran the same year, but their election timing was different than my town. So my town's town elections are in May. So I go to my local library. I mean, especially before my other kids were in school, 2 or 3 times a week, right? It's free. There's stuff for kids to play with. A lot of moms gather there. They were introducing some programming that got into a lot of gender ideology, and I just didn't think it was appropriate age-wise for children. And I'm okay with people disagreeing with me, but I went to the library board with my concerns, and I didn't feel that they were heard in any kind of respectful way. My biggest issue with them was that they didn't seem to care to hear any feedback about these things. And it wasn't like I thought I was going to persuade them not to do the event, but I thought it would have been nice if they'd at least either sat down with me or responded to my emails in a kind and not like sarcastic, snippy way, because they're elected officials. So a lot of towns are like this. We have 6 library board members, I believe, and every 2 years, 2 of them are up for re-election. So I'm, a little bit of a confrontational person, and I thought, well, give them a run for their money. I'll run against them, because in my town's history, going back at least the past 7 or 8 years, nobody's run against the incumbents for the library board. This has largely been an appointed position. It'll be somebody's friend they'll stick on when their term is up. And so our town clerk's office was just like, how are there? So I convinced my friend to run with me for the other seat. So there were 2 seats that were going to be up. And we have a local town sort of, it's like our town television station. They interview all the candidates. So I did that interview. And it was very interesting because online, when I would try to post, my campaign page, which was really about very local things, right? The main issues facing our library were that we were potentially relocating, and that our town doesn't really have any kind of rec center for young people. And so it was like use of the library and using that as an intergenerational space. These were the kinds of things facing the library. I was not running on no drag queen story time. That was not my campaign slogan, right? But in my town, all of the questions that came up from people were about book banning and the gender ideology events, which I found very interesting because I had a hard time finding that any books were being banned in my town. I'm not saying it doesn't happen in other schools, but it's not something that happens very often where I live. But every time I would try to post my campaign page, people would find the ASP platform, post it under my name, say she ran with this party, and then people would freak out. So that was really interesting. So my friend and I ended up getting 25% of the vote for the two of us, and then the incumbents won the campaign. But what I found most interesting, there was someone in my town who sent an email out. This is sort of a very like New England thing, to the local kids town soccer league listserv, about her, candidates that she was endorsing. And she pulled a line from an interview I'd done on the presidential campaign about how I thought gospel values ought to influence policy. She didn't even give anything beyond that, right? That quote was enough in her mind to sort of damn me, that I was like this terrible person. And I found it so fascinating because everyone's values inform how they shape policy or how they want policy.
Wayne talked about this, yeah.
No matter who you are. And so me being a Christian, this person being Muslim, this person being an atheist, it's all going to eventually impact the way we see the world and the way we want policy to be formed. So it was so comical to me that anger against me was, this woman claims to be Christian, and so it was very interesting. This was after I had spoken with this woman for an hour and a half. She runs a podcast that she interviews candidates on. She's very, very vocal on certain issues that she and I do not agree on, but I wanted to go on her podcast anyway and just talk to her. And I thought we had a very respectful rapport, but it was just so interesting to me. So to sort of go back to something we were talking about before recording, a lot of my town races go unchallenged every year. And we really need people running in those local spots. So I think as I sort of, went through this campaign, my town's pretty small. It's only 15,000 people. I think about 11,000 registered voters. And of those, maybe 2,000 vote in the local elections. You'll get bigger numbers for presidential elections. People would say, oh, what does the library board do? Or like, who's on it? Or, they've never really taken a look at what's on the town website. But all the information is pretty easy to find. And I also think that people worry that they need to be experts to run. You can learn a lot about some of these committees just by going back and reading the minutes online. You can kind of get a sense of what the major issues are. If you win, there's going to be more senior people than you who can show you the ropes and some of this stuff. Like you don't have to be some kind of, now ideally for some of the more specialized things, you'll have some, knowledge, say if you're joining like the zoning board or something, but even then, a lot of it just has to do with community interest. Do you have the best interest of your community at heart? That's going to help you make those decisions, and you'll learn as you go. So my big thing is run locally, because you'll learn so much from that you can then use for bigger races if you really like it, if you want to keep doing it.
Lauren, this is something that I kind of get different perspectives from different people in the party on that I find interesting. Is you're telling people to run local. Is that just to get people to get the confidence to be able to jump into these bigger races and the experience to be able to do that? Because I see in the party there's kind of this split between where our focus should be. And should we focus on these achievable, nonpartisan, mostly, races in local communities, or should we focus on, statewide, national, federal elections where we have the party's name attached to candidates and, get FEC benefits and all that kind of stuff? Where is your philosophy for the ASP right now at this moment in time?
So I think this is going to sound kind of like a cop-out, but we need to have a healthy balance, because those names, for example, running for governor of California, that helps people become aware of us, right? And those campaigns need a lot more financial support. I mean, if I had spent money on my library board campaign, it would have cost a few $100s max. But some of these bigger campaigns to get ballot access or to get a written statement or however the state works. But I think for local, it kind of depends on the person and their skill set. So if you're someone who, maybe you want to be a spokesperson for the party, but you don't necessarily, you know that the chances of you winning are incredibly small. So you want to represent the party well, but you are maybe not going to, plan to get into the nitty gritty of local governance in long term. I think doing something like letting the party use your name on a write-in, or running in one of these big offices makes a lot of sense. If you're someone who, though, could see yourself as good at local politics, as growing in it, and you want to run a campaign that you think you could win, I think getting involved locally is the easiest place to start. And, like you said, most of those races are nonpartisan. So people aren't finding out about the party from that. But that gives people campaign experience that they can then contribute to these larger races. So they're helpful. They're very, very helpful for the party. I think for what I learned from the race in Holliston, of that, did all the messaging I used and did all the techniques I used, would they bear out on a larger campaign for ASP? Not everything is applicable, but learning about, those lessons I learned of I thought I had a really good conversation with this person and then they wrote this nasty thing. Those kinds of things that you learn when you do politics are useful on a larger campaign. So for me, I like both things. But for someone else, they might not. They might prefer. I had a gentleman here in Massachusetts who, unfortunately, he's sick with cancer. But the last gubernatorial campaign, he's like, we have to run someone against. He's like, you can use my name. I don't care, right? It was just the fact that we have to offer an alternative. Is he going to run for his town council? No, probably not. So it's what people are good at, what their skill sets are, what they would like to do. It's hard to say, because putting your name on the ballot, you could get called upon for interviews and for candidate questionnaires. So it's not saying that that's not a big commitment. It still is a commitment of your time and it's a commitment of your reputation, as I was saying before. But it's a more of a short-term commitment than we have a alderman in Batavia, Illinois, for example, but he is actually on the town council, right? And he's affecting policy. So that's a long-term commitment for him. I don't know how many years his term is, but that's definitely a long-term commitment for him.
Well, how do we recruit candidates for this, Lauren? I know that the ASP is really good about once somebody signs on and comes over, you get stuck in places. That's what happened to me. And I was kind of nervous. Yeah, it happens to everybody. I mean, even Carvell has been utilized for, social media stuff. So how do we go about recruiting quality candidates, not somebody who just feels obligated to run or thinks it would be cool, somebody who actually feels like it's meant to make a difference? And once we have those candidates, what do we need to do to support them? What's lacking?
Just one example recently is there are other parts of New England that don't have state leadership. So I've been receiving a lot of the inquiries that come in for other states. And I just sort of noticed there were a couple guys in New Hampshire that they both had experience in politics who were joining the party. So I reached out to our state development leader. And I said, would you just talk on the phone with these guys and see? Because it would be great if they could become state leaders, but they might be interested in becoming candidates as well. So I think keeping an eye out in your state, in your area. So I have had a couple of people come to ASP Massachusetts with experience of holding elected office. We've had a library board member from another town. There's a gentleman who's on the town council of Franklin, Massachusetts, which is a relatively big town in the suburbs of Boston. And those people, I try to be as supportive of their campaigns as possible. I try to sort of alert people to when they're running and things like that. Because obviously a town council, we don't all live in his town. We can't vote for him, but we can still give money to his campaign. It's hard. Like you said, people are burnt out of politics in general. It is very hard to convince people to get involved in it. And so you kind of have to always be on the lookout for someone who has some talent or maybe the drive to do it. But also, I think kind of letting people know that, again, they don't have to be experts. They don't have to know everything about this committee or that to do it. I do think if you're going to, and just like in terms of success with things like state rep or House of Representatives, state Congress, those people get to those offices by building connections locally first, by winning local races first. So it's not likely that you're going to jump in from a third party and be able to do that if you don't have any sort of roots or network around you. If we push people to get more involved civically, just like go to your town meeting, or this is what we have in New England, it's called town meetings, vote in your town elections. Most of us are living in places where if we spend a few months paying attention, like we'll kind of get a sense of what's going on. Mm-hmm. It's hard because a lot of us move around a lot. Our generation just moves around a lot. It's hard to have roots. I've only lived here for 5.5 years, right? So, and there are people who are more townies, have been here forever, that kind of thing. But I think when you push people to get just more engaged, it does give them a sense of like, hey, lots of us don't know what we're doing. In fact, lots of people sitting in office don't know what they're doing.
Wisdom of the crowds. Eventually we'll get the knowledge we need.
But, and like you're saying, Lauren, it doesn't take, you don't have to have any kind of political experience to look around you and see what the issues are. We've lived in this area twice, and prior to COVID, when we lived here the first time, you immediately, first day here, traffic's bad. Schools in this area are good, but there's no affordable housing near these schools. So the people whose kids go to these schools can't even live in this area. There's a lot of big money interests that you could see the influence on development and things that were happening. So you just have to look around to see those issues. And like you're saying, you don't have to be specialized in housing developments and traffic science. There's people that you can appeal to for that knowledge.
I know that right now, like you said, people are burnt out. There's so much going on. But I would say one of the big things I learned from the presidential campaign and meeting people across the country who are really committed to human dignity, there are so many good people who align with our values out there. So just to not get discouraged, because it can feel like you're in the minority, but so many people just aren't vocal about these opinions, or they're scared to voice whatever they think. And so just to know that there are people out there who care deeply about the dignity of the human person and who are voting that way.
Well, just to add to that, Lauren, I have a shirt, and when I wear my ASP shirt out, almost every time I go out, at least one person is like, hey, I voted for that. Oh, and I've even had a few that are like, I've looked at your stuff. I like it. I'm not committed yet, but I really like what you're doing. So the people are out there, and even if they're not voting, they're at least looking into us. And that's what really gives me hope.
Yeah, I got to go on a radio show for Jonesboro, Arkansas. And it was funny because I was using some of the talking points that we might think are kind of trite or overused, but to the host, he hadn't heard them before. So I said things like pro-life for the whole life. He's like, oh, I like that, And I'm thinking, oh, that's like the most overused phrase ever, that we're always saying it, right? But he hadn't heard it. So some
it's Jonesboro.
People haven't heard the message, and they might be interested in what you have to offer.
So thank you guys for tuning in to the We Have Issues podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation we had. Again, do not forget to like, subscribe, and even share this video. My name is Carvell.
I'm Chris.
I'm Matt.
I'm Lauren.
You guys have a great day. Thank you.